Welcome to Basic Economic Concepts 1. Let's get started. There are 4 phases to the business cycle. The test loves you to know what they are, what they look like, and the order that they go in. They look like this. Expansion, also called recovery, when the economy is growing. Peak, the top of the economic cycle. Contraction, when the economy is cooling off. And trough, the bottom of that cycle. What would come next? Another expansion. So you have to know the order: expansion, peak, contraction, trough. You have to know that we don't know how long any of them will last, but we do know what's going to come next. The test will want you to be familiar with a few of the characteristics of each of the phases of the business cycle. An expansion always follows what phase? Trough. Some of the characteristics that you will see in an expansion include employment picks up, consumer spending returns, consumer sentiment is positive, businesses begin placing new orders, inventory increases, bank lending grows, GDP, which is gross domestic product, increases, temporary staffing increases, new car sales are strong, the stock market rallies, and shipping increases. When you have questions on this topic on the test, just put yourself into that phase of the business cycle. So when we're experiencing an economic expansion or recovery, you're most likely to buy a new car. All of your friends are fully employed. The stock market is doing well. That will help you with the test questions. What is after an expansion? Where are we in this chart? We are at the peak. The thing about the peak is you never really know when you're there until after we begin to contract. Some of the characteristics of the peak. Businesses have reached their productive capacity. They cannot produce more goods. The peak is the month that the expansion turns into a contraction. It always occurs after the recovery. It always precedes a contraction. Other things you see during the economic peak is the height of employment, height of production, and the height of consumer spending. After the peak, what do we have? Yep. Contraction. One of the first signs of a coming contraction is an inverted yield curve, which we'll discuss in a moment. Other things we see during a contraction: an increase in unemployment. So people's hours get cut, they get laid off. A decrease in consumer spending, a decline in production, a decrease in gross domestic product, loss of consumer confidence, also called consumer sentiment, temporary staffing decreases, new car sales decline, the stock market goes down, credit card debt and late payments both go up, new home starts decrease. Once again, on the test, just put yourself into an economic contraction. What happens during that period of time? Instead of working full-time, you're working 30 hours a week. You're probably not going to buy a new washing machine. You're not going to buy a new car. You're going to repair your car, repair your washing machine. You're not going to go spend as much money as you did before. Generally, the stock market is decreasing during a contraction. What comes next? The trough. Similarly to the peak, we don't know when we're in the trough until we start to expand again. So what are some signs that we may see in a trough? Economic activity hits the lowest point. Prices hit a floor. And it's the month in which we begin to expand again. So as low as we can go, and then we grow. Some other definitions that the test definitely likes. Recession and depression. So related to this idea of a contraction, the test wants you to know how long do these last for. A depression is at least 6 consecutive quarters of declining GDP, gross domestic product, where a recession is at least 2. So definitely questions on the test. So depending upon when you were born, how old you were during 2008, 2009, I personally can very much remember this period in the business cycle, if you will, and it wasn't pretty. So 2008, 2009, contraction. I remember the cover of Time when they finally put a bear on the cover of Time because the market was bearish. It was a very big deal. It took a long time for them to finally, the media, to admit that we were in a recession. And in the end, when it was all over, we labeled it the Great Recession. There's a reason for that. That's because we got to 5 consecutive quarters of decline in GDP. We were almost to the term depression, but not quite. Thus the term Great Recession. Switching gears, the test wants you to feel comfortable with types of industries. There are 4 types of industries you must know. Growth, defensive, cyclical, and counter-cyclical. Your client would like to invest in the stock market and make lots of money, would like appreciation, isn't looking for income. What kind of stocks would be good for your client? Growth stocks. Growth companies allow the client the opportunity to make money. Also allow the opportunity to lose their shirt, right? No reward without a lot of risk. Growth companies pay low to no dividends. They have low to no earnings. They have volatile stock prices. They have high price earnings ratios. Defensive industries are those that resist market cycles. So nothing to do with military stock at all. Every once in a while the test tries to trick you. No, that's not it. It's in an economic recession, what do you do no matter what? Or maybe you do it more. You drink, you smoke, you take your prescription drugs, you heat your home. All of these industries are defensive. They resist market cycles. So alcohol, tobacco, pharmaceuticals, oil and gas, and public utilities. So feel comfortable with examples of defensive companies. Cyclical industries expand during an expansion and contract during a contraction. They are cyclical. You'll buy a new car during an expansion. The automobile industry is cyclical. Other cyclical industries include steel, heavy equipment, and capital goods. Capital goods is a fancy way of saying home appliances. So you buy a new fridge instead of fixing your fridge. You get a new washer and dryer. When the economy is doing well, these are all examples of cyclical industries. The last type of industry is counter-cyclical. Counter-cyclical contract during an expansion, the opposite of cyclical, and expand during a contraction. The best examples of counter-cyclical industries are gold and mining stocks. It's very common when the stock market starts to go down, people pull their money out, prices are going down. So what are the people that are pulling their money out doing? They're driving the prices down. They put their money into gold because they feel like it's safe. I'm not saying you should ever say that to your client. Don't say that to your client. However, historically, they have been counter-cyclical. The prices of gold are counter-cyclical prices. Monetary and fiscal policies. There are two ways that the United States attempts to control the phase of the business cycle. If you were to ask anybody, they want to live in this forever long expansion. Nobody wants the contraction that is inevitable following the peak of economic activity, right? Nobody does. So how does the US try to control these two things? There's two ways they do it. So we have monetary and fiscal policy. So feel comfortable with how these things work. So monetary policy set by the Federal Reserve. Fiscal policy set by Congress and the President. Fiscal policy is budgetary and tax laws. Monetary policy has lots of different components to it. So questions in this area, they'll give you examples and you will have to know which is which. So Congress and the President, fiscal. Changes in interest rates, changes in the federal funds rate, changes in the discount rate, changes in the reserve requirement. All of that is monetary policy. When they change the estate tax exclusion amount, what's that? Fiscal or monetary? Fiscal. So those are examples of types of questions you can expect in this area. Let's expand on the Federal Reserve. Open market operations of the Federal Reserve. Open market operations is when the Federal Reserve either buys or sells U.S. government securities in the open market with U.S. government securities dealers. So there's two different strategies that they can embark on, they being the Federal Reserve. They can buy U.S. government securities. Now think about this. If the Fed buys U.S. government securities, they take out of the economy the securities, so U.S. government securities, and put in what? Oh yeah, lots and lots of dollars. I suppose it depends on how many times they do it, but they are known to do this. It's called quantitative easing, or QE, quantitative easing, when the Fed buys U.S. government securities. It's done to stimulate spending. If they're embarking on this strategy to stimulate spending, they must be trying to fight a contraction or a recession. This is also called expansionary monetary policy. Expansionary monetary policy. When the Federal Reserve buys U.S. government securities through the open market committee, through their open market operations. You have to feel comfortable with what happens if they choose to sell U.S. government securities. So when they do that, they sell U.S. government securities, they take money out of the economy. One of the root causes of inflation is too many dollars chasing too few of goods. So when they embark on selling U.S. government securities, they take the money out of circulation. They're doing this to fight inflation. They're doing it in an attempt to contract the economy. So it's also referred to as contractionary monetary policy. So they put the securities into the economy, take the money out. So one of their strategies. It's actually the most commonly used strategy to control the economic cycle that we are in. The buying or selling, as the case may be, of U.S. government securities. What else can the Fed do? They can change the reserve requirement. They're very unlikely to do this, however. So the reserve requirement is how much cash on hand must the bank have at any given moment. When we are in an economic contraction, what is the Fed likely, or what could they do? Because actually they're not likely to do it, but what could they do to stimulate spending? They could lower the reserve requirement for the bank. Then the bank would have more money to lend out. So vice versa would be true if we have an overheating economy, which means that we have high inflation. The Fed could raise a bank's reserve requirements, thus the bank would have less money to lend out, and that would fight inflation. So raising reserve requirements would be contractionary, lowering reserve requirements would be expansionary policy. The Federal Reserve is in charge of some interest rates. The test wants you to feel comfortable with 3 major interest rates. The most sensitive indicator of interest rate direction is called the federal funds rate. Always a test question. The rate that the Federal Reserve will charge a member bank for a loan is called the discount rate. And the rate that a commercial bank's best customer would pay for a loan is called the prime rate. So the prime rate is set by banks themselves. It varies by region, it varies by bank. It is changed in accordance with changes in the discount rate and federal funds rate, but it's not, prime is not set by the Federal Reserve. Test question. So what is set by the Federal Reserve? The discount rate, set by Federal Reserve. And this makes sense because this is a loan from the Fed to a member bank. So it is a short-term loan ranging from 30 days to 90 days. If you have ever heard reference to the lending window of the Federal Reserve, that's what we're talking about. This discount rate where the Fed lends money and they charge the discount rate to the member bank. So what is the federal funds rate besides being the most sensitive indicator of interest rate direction? It is the shortest term loan. It is an overnight loan. Most sensitive indicator of interest rate direction. The rate itself is not set by the Fed. Instead, the Fed sets a target for this rate. And the reasoning behind that is that this is a loan overnight, shortest term loan there is, from member bank to member bank, not from Fed to bank, bank to bank. Overnight loan to meet reserve requirements. Federal funds rate. Let me give you a couple of examples that I think will help with these interest rates. Federal funds rate. On March 16th, 2020, the Fed set the target range for the federal funds rate at 0 to 0.25%. That's like 0. It's really low. It's as low as it can go. Give you some historical context since I referenced the Great Recession earlier. The beginning of the Great Recession, or, we didn't know it was happening yet, January 2008, the target for the federal funds rate was 3.5. By the end of the year, it was only 0.25%. That's crazy. Some numbers related to the discount rate set by the Fed. In May 2020, the discount rate, 0.25, historical all-time low. In January 2008, the discount rate was 4.75%. By the end of that year, 2008, the discount rate was only 0.5%, 50 basis points. The prime rate in May 2020 was around 3.25. We don't know exactly because it varies. It depends on what you're looking at. In January 2008, the prime rate was approximately 6.98%. By the end of the year, it was 3.61. So hopefully those examples give you some just real world context to what can feel like it's so out there, like it doesn't apply to you, when in fact it does. And if you're going to go get a loan at the bank, you're not going to pay prime, you're going to pay prime plus more than prime, right? No examples of expansionary monetary policy. It's also referred to as loose monetary policy. When is the Fed going to engage in an expansionary monetary policy? When we're in a contraction, recession, or depression, done to stimulate spending. So a lot of these we've already talked about, but just to review: lowering the federal funds rate, discount rate, lowering banks' reserve requirements, buying U.S. government securities in the open market. Expansionary policies put money into the economy, designed to stimulate spending. Contractionary policies do the opposite of that, designed to rein in inflation. They would be things like raising the target for the federal funds rate, raising the discount rate, raising banks' reserve requirements, and selling U.S. government securities in the open market, designed to get money out of circulation and/or make money harder to get. All designed to tame the flame of inflation. Principal economic theories. Economic theories are used in an attempt to explain and predict economic activity, as well as provide solutions for issues within our economy. It's never which one's right, because that is very subjective. Whole entire dissertations are written on which of these is correct. It's just what are some of their key components. Keynesian economists believe that lower levels of taxation and higher government spending can get the U.S. out of recessions. Classical economists believe that the less government regulation, the better. It's a laissez-faire approach. They believe in the efficiency of free markets to generate economic development. Monetarists believe that the quantity of money in circulation determines overall price levels and economic activity and can be used to help the U.S. rise from a recession. Supply-side economists believe that economic growth can be most effectively created by lowering taxes and decreasing regulation. So Keynesian lower taxes, just like supply side. But Keynesian believes in government spending. Supply side believes in lower taxes, less regulation. So feel comfortable just with those definitions. Earlier I mentioned that the inverted yield curve is often a precursor to a recession. What is an inverted yield curve? So there's lots of different yield curves out there. The one that the test cares about is the yield curve of U.S. government securities. So let's start off by being normal. If I'm going to ask you to tie up your money for a year, 10 years, or 30 years, which one are you going to demand the highest interest payment? The longest till expiration of the debt, right? 30 years. That's normal. So we have short-term debt, we have mid-term debt, we have long-term debt. Another way of saying this when we're talking about U.S. government securities would be treasury bills, notes, they're mid-term, and then bonds. So a normal yield curve, the lowest yield is on the short-term instrument, a little bit higher, mid-term, higher, long-term. This is positive, positive being normal. Now let me ask you, if long-term interest rates go up, what's going to happen to the yield curve? If long-term interest rates go up, the yield curve is going to steepen because interest rates and yields move in the same direction. If long-term interest rates go up, the yield curve is going to steepen. The positive yield curve is going to steepen. What if the interest rates are all about the same? That is called a flat yield curve. If the yield is the highest on the short-term instrument, a little bit lower on the midterm, and lowest on the long term, that is a negative yield curve. Inverted is another way that they'll describe it. Inverted. Precursor to recession. It's not normal. So an inverted yield curve can be the result of high current demand for money relative to supply. It may also be caused by a sharp increase in short-term interest rates with the expectation that they will come down in the near term. Remember, if interest rates go up, yields go up too. If interest rates go down, yields go down too. The credit spread is used to describe the difference in cost of borrowing between the U.S. government and a corporation. So the U.S. government issues debt. It's a form of borrowing. How much do they have to pay to issue debt? Let's say they have to pay 4%. Let's say for the same term of debt, a corporation can only sell it if they pay a 10% nominal yield. The difference between these two is called the credit spread. So there is always a difference. It's just if it's really far away, that's a negative indicator for economic conditions. When it narrows, so if it was 4 and 10 and now it's 3 and 5, so it's narrowed, that is generally a welcome sign of positive economic activity ahead. That concludes our discussion for basic economic concepts. 1, there's a topic quiz. Make sure you take the topic quiz. You want to get a 90% or better before moving on. I'll see you in the next video.